All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. You all ready to dive in? All right, it's really hard speaking after Nancy Piercy because she's amazing and I would much rather listen to her for another hour than listen to myself. But nonetheless, thank you for being here. There are 3 great talks going on right now. Well, there's 2 great talks and there's me, but lots of great places that you could be right now, and so thank you for being here. You don't have to, but if you want to move in kind of towards the middle, that would just help my peripheral vision kind of thing. Not important, but if you want me to look at you, then that's going to have to happen. It is a real privilege and a pleasure to be here at Stand Firm. I really am kind of geeked out because Nancy Piercy and Tim McGrew are like 2 of my heroes, and so getting to hear them speak is just fantastic. And I do hope that there's something in this breakout session that will be helpful for you this evening. So our topic this evening, I want to talk about the question of evil and suffering in the world. And my contention is going to be very simple, that an acknowledgement of real evil in the world serves as an argument for, not against, the existence of God. Skeptics oftentimes argue that evil and suffering tend to undermine Christianity. My thesis is the opposite, that the existence of evil supports a Christian worldview. My primary focus is going to be on evil and suffering within the context of a Christian atheism debate, but I think the points are going to apply more broadly as well. I've provided you with a handout, okay? It's got 2 sides, right? 2 sides to the handout. It's got an outline, many blanks to fill in. I find that helps keep me kind of engaged and following along if I'm in your shoes. And I also find that some people like making paper airplanes and origami flamingos. And so either purpose, I'm quite happy if the handout serves either one of those for you. So let's dive in together. What do we mean by evil? We want to engage here in 2 preliminary matters before diving into the primary question. First, we got to articulate what evil is, talk about the reality of evil, and then second, we need to identify evil as what I call a universal worldview problem, okay? So what do we mean by evil? If we're going to engage a so-called problem of evil, we better have a handle on what it is that we're talking about, okay? One of the first kind of forms in philosophy is defining terms. So what do we mean by evil? Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines evil as morally reprehensible or causing harm. Dictionary.com articulates evil as an adjective as morally wrong or bad, harmful, injurious, or wicked. As a noun, evil is the wicked or immoral part of someone or something. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy distinguishes broad evil from a narrow concept of evil. In a broad sense, evil is any bad state of affairs, wrongful action, or character flaw. In its narrow sense, evil, quote, picks out only the most morally despicable sorts of actions, characters, and events. And both broad and narrow evils can be moral or natural in origin. Moral evil results from the intentions or negligence of moral actions, while natural evil is bad states of affairs which occur independently of actions of moral agents. And our primary focus tonight is going to be on moral evil. So taking these definitions as a whole, evil I'm going to define as the occurrence of bad or negative states of affairs due to the wicked intentions or moral negligence on the part of free-willed moral agents. Now, arriving at this kind of a definition of evil can be contentious, right? Some people might want to dispute it. But even if someone wants to nitpick the definition of evil, it could still be possible to recognize evil in its occurrences. There's once a famous court case in Chicago where a judge declared, "I may not be able to define pornography, but I know it when I see it, and that's it." And so I think we may be able to do the same sort of thing with evil. We may not be able to arrive at an agreed upon definition, but we can still recognize evil when we see it. So the late comedian and atheist George Carlin, I got to tell you, the longer you live, the more you look around, the more you realize something is wrong here. War, disease, death, destruction, hunger, filth, torture, crime, corruption, the ice capades, something is definitely wrong. This anecdote from the atheist neuroscientist Sam Harris. Imagine you are a young widow who's lived her entire life in the midst of civil war. Today, your 7-year-old daughter was raped and dismembered before your eyes. Worse still, the perpetrator was your 14-year-old son, who was goaded to this evil at the point of a machete by a press gang of drug-addled soldiers. You are now running barefoot through the jungle with killers in pursuit. So I trust that even if we can't agree upon a definition of evil, we can recognize that yes, evil is a reality. Right? Whether it's the ice capades or sadistic tribal wars or 8 a.m. college classes or widespread poverty, the Holocaust of abortion or fake news or the Dallas Cowboys, we can acknowledge the reality of bad or negative states of affairs due to the wicked intentions or moral negligence on the part of free-willed moral agents. Okay, so now our agreement on the existence of evil and suffering is a crucial starting point to any discussion about evil in general or the problem of evil in particular, and it leads to the second preliminary point that we need to establish. Evil is a universal worldview problem. All worldviews, not just Christianity, all worldviews have to respond to the reality of evil in the world. So a worldview, broadly stated, is the conceptual lens through which we see, understand, and interpret the world and our place within it. So worldviews can be theistic or non-theistic, religious or non-religious, but all worldviews have to deal with the reality of evil. And there's 3 parts to this. First, all worldviews acknowledge the existence and or experience of evil and suffering. Even worldviews which might reject or at least question the objective reality of evil, like Hinduism with its notion of Maya, nonetheless embrace the personal experience of evil. Secondly, all worldviews recognize that such evil is not the way that things ought to be. Right, so the brilliant French mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal noted this ubiquitous human feeling that things in the universe have gone wrong, that things are no longer the way they once were, and that we have fallen from a great height. Humpty Dumpty has fallen. It's a sentiment that's present not only in religious worldviews like Christianity, but also in animistic, tribal, and other ancient worldviews with no such scriptural imperative as a biblical fall. So Pascal writes, in short, I'm going to shorten the quote, "Who would think himself unhappy not to be king, except one who had been dispossessed? Who would think himself unhappy if he had only one mouth, and who would not if he had only one eye? It has probably never occurred to anyone to be distressed at not having 3 eyes, but those who have none are inconsolable." In other words, we recognize that there's a way things should be, and we're not happy if things aren't that way. Human beings are designed such that we should have 2 eyes, and if we don't, we're unhappy. Now he says, why are we unhappy not to be king? Because there was a time in which things were right, and we were, as it were, kings in creation. So human beings all note, he says, that we have the impression that things are not the way they once were, or the way things ought to be. So what does this mean? It means, he says, that all worldviews must account for the existence or experience of evil and suffering. As I argue in our recently released worldview textbook, all worldviews must answer the core worldview question, what is our problem? Okay, Buddhism holds in its 4 noble truths that suffering is caused by desire or by craving. Islam holds that evil and suffering are the result of humans' refusal to submit to Allah's straight path. Christianity holds that evil and suffering is a result of what? The fall. Hinduism, in some forms, holds that evil and suffering do not exist, but the experience of evil is the result of being confused as to the true state of reality. And the point here is, again, simply to note that evil and suffering pose a universal worldview problem. Now, in circles of Christian philosophy and apologetics, we often hear mention of the problem of evil, referencing the thought that evil and suffering in the world pose a specific challenge to the truthfulness of Christian faith. And we'll deal with that contention, but in the moment we have to acknowledge that evil and suffering pose a problem not just for Christianity, but for all worldviews. All worldviews must account for why there is evil and suffering in the world. All right, so 2 quick things that we've seen. First, evil can be defined as bad or negative states of affairs. Second, the existence and or experience of evil is a universal worldview problem. Now I want to narrow the debate and consider the existence of evil within the Christian atheist debate. And I want to zero in on 2 specific contending worldviews, right? That of Orthodox Christian theism and that of secular humanism or atheism. And the basic question is this: which worldview, Christianity or atheism, best accounts for the existence and experience of evil and suffering in the world? My contention is that while atheists frequently offer the problem of evil as evidence that God doesn't exist, the contrary argument is much stronger. That is, evil and suffering serve as evidence for, not against, the existence of God and the truthfulness of Christianity. Now, traditionally, the problem of evil is an instrumental arrow in the quiver of philosophical atheists. So once again, the comedian George Carlin, when it comes to believing in God, he says, I really tried. I really, really tried. I tried to believe that there's a God who created each of us in his own image, who loves us very much and keeps a close eye on things. I tried to believe that, but I got to tell you, the longer you live, the more you look around, the more you realize something is wrong here. This is not good work. If this is the best God can do, I am not impressed. Results like these do not belong on the resume of a supreme being. This is the kind of blankety blank you'd expect from an office temp with a bad attitude. Similarly, America's most widely read agnostic, the biblical scholar Bart Ehrman, states, I came to a point, former Christian, right? I came to the point where I could no longer believe. I realized that I could no longer reconcile the claims of faith with the facts of life. In particular, I could no longer explain how there can be a good and all-powerful God actively involved in this world, given the state of things. For many people who inhabit this world, life is a cesspool of misery and suffering. I came to the point where I simply could not believe that there is a good and kindly disposed ruler who is in charge of it. So historically, then, evil and suffering pose a challenge to the Christian faith. And there are three versions or families of the atheistic problem of evil: a logical, evidential, and existential version. Okay, all three are listed on your handout. We're not going to go through all three. In fact, I'm going to skip over most of it because I want to get to my positive argument, the argument for God from evil. But very briefly before I do so, I want to talk a little bit about the logical and evidential versions of the atheistic problem from evil. And my argument is going to be that the atheist's argument against God from evil fails. That is, there is no successful problem of evil that demonstrates the non-existence of God. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about logical and evidential. I won't talk at all about existential, simply in the interests of time. So the logical problem of evil makes a very strong claim that given the existence of God, of Christianity, there should be no evil in the world. But given that there clearly is evil, then it follows that God must not exist. Okay? This is the way Epicurus puts it. I'm going to just skip right on over that. David Hume puts it in this way: if God exists, evil would not exist, but evil does exist, therefore God does not exist. This is a straightforward modus tollens argument. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. And so if the premises are true, then the conclusion would follow. Thoughtful theists and atheists alike would say, well, why would it be that if God exists, there would be no evil? J.L. Mackie in the 20th century took up that challenge of trying to draw the logical connection between the existence of God and the non-existence of evil. And he said, look, if God exists, God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. If he's omnipotent, he has the ability to prevent evil. If he's omniscient, he knows how to prevent evil. If he's omnibenevolent, he has the desire to prevent evil. Therefore, if he exists, he has the ability, knowledge, how, and desire to prevent evil, and there would be no evil. So if God exists, there would be no evil, but there is evil, therefore God does not exist. Now, this is a more vigorous form of the logical problem of evil to work with. Okay? Now, if you look at this argument, again, I'm not going to race through it in detailed form. Premise 1 seems clearly true. Premise 5 follows from premises 2 through 4. And then premises 5 and 6 together are a modus tollens argument again, such that premise 7 would follow. So if there's a problem in the argument, where would it have to lie? 2 through 4, okay? Premises 2, 3, and 4. If there's a problem in the argument, that's where it has to lie, right? So when we look at the argument, we find that is indeed where the problem lies. So start with premise 4. An omnibenevolent being has the desire to prevent evil. Now, Christians will generally affirm that in an unthinking kind of manner. Oh, yeah, if God is good, God wants to prevent evil. But it actually doesn't quite follow the way that we think it might. I think we would affirm that God has a desire to prevent evil, all other things being equal, okay? And that's an important qualification. So we might want to say that an omnibenevolent being has the ability, or the prima facie desire, to prevent evil. But then we'll ask the question, might there be something that overrides this prima facie desire? And I suggest that there might be two things. First, perhaps God is accomplishing some greater good through evils that he permits to occur. All right, so think of it this way. So how many of you have kids? Anybody out there have children? Okay. Anybody remember taking your kids to their first inoculations, getting their shots for the first time? Anybody remember that experience? This was a very traumatic experience, not just for my son, but also for me. So my son, he's now 17. He's going to graduate high school this year. But when he was 3 months old, we took him to the health clinic in Canada, right? So I actually came further than New York. I'm from Canada, but I came via Oklahoma, so kind of cheating, right? Took him to the health clinic to get his first shots, and this is our firstborn and our son, and so I go with him, of course, right? I want to be there, right? And the nurse is very friendly, and she asks me, it's really interesting, that the nurse asks the dad to hold the kid. I think it's evil, but that's okay. Asks me to hold him, and I'm like, okay. She says, now make sure you're holding his arms tight to his body. I'm like, okay. So I'm holding his arms tight to his body, right? And she's a very pleasant young woman, and she's talking to our little son, and he's kind of giggling away, and she tinkles a little toy in front of his face, and he kind of giggles away, and then she jabs him in the arm. And what does my son do? Screams? No, there's something he does before he screams. This is the heartbreaking thing that he does. He looks at me with this look on his face, words that I could read as clear as day. I thought you loved me. Broke my heart. I started crying. My son's bawling and screaming, and I'm crying. But this is why they make the dad hold the child, right? So that there's no mommy issues that are going on. So he's just mad at dad, right? But how does my son experience that encounter? Evil, suffering, right? Now, as a parent, I have a rule of thumb that I try to follow. Don't let strangers stab my children with sharp objects. That's a rule that I have, right? So if we're walking down the street and somebody comes towards us with a knife in their hand, I'm going to stand between them and my son, right? Why do I go to the health clinic and allow a stranger to stab my son with a sharp object? For the greater good, right? Because of the greater good that's being accomplished through this experience, which is being encountered by my son as evil, right? So could it be that sometimes God is working a greater good through the evil that occurs? Well, absolutely it could be. So a Christian might want to change premise 4 to an omnibenevolent being has a morally sufficient reason to permit evil, and thus an ultima facie desire to not prevent all evil, a desire that overrides his prima facie desire to prevent it, okay? It's the second path, and again, we're just racing through this. Understand, there's so much more that can and needs to be said about all of this. We're just scratching the surface, okay? The second way is the way that Alvin Plantinga goes, and it's called the free will defense. Perhaps, he suggests, the greater good that justifies God permitting evil is the creation of significantly free creatures. He says a world containing creatures who are significantly free is more valuable, all else being equal, than a world containing no free creatures at all. But J.L. Mankey asks, why couldn't God create free will creatures who always do good? It seems logically possible. But Plantinga says, well, no, I don't think that God actually could do that. Right? God can't do all things that are apparently logically possible, right? There are some things that God cannot do. God cannot create a world in which he does not exist, right? God cannot create a world in which he sins. So even though it might be conceivable for God to create a world in which he doesn't exist, it's not a world that's actualizable. Well, perhaps it's the same, Plantinga says, when it comes to free-willed creatures. It might seem to us conceivable for God to create free-willed creatures who always do right, but perhaps it's not an actualizable world. Right? Perhaps there is no such possible world in which free-willed creatures never go wrong. And if this is the case, then even an omnipotent being cannot create a world in which free-willed creatures never go wrong. In other words, the creation of free-willed creatures entails the existence of evil. Now, take it or leave it as you want, but even atheists are generally convinced that Plantinga's response to the logical problem of evil puts the nail in the coffin, right? So James Beebe, an atheistic philosopher at the University of Buffalo, after a long discussion of Mackey and Plantinga's back and forth, says it seems that the free will defense successfully defeats the logical problem of evil. He says it's very grudgingly and not happily, but nonetheless, he says this seems to be what follows. All right, really quickly, the evidential problem of evil. William Rose suggests that maybe God could have a permissible reason for allowing some evil to exist, but not the amount and kind of evil that we see. So Rose says there is evil in the world that is gratuitous. That is, it serves no greater good, at least no greater good that we can see. And if God existed, there would be no such evil, right? There would be no evil that doesn't fulfill some greater good. But there is evil that doesn't serve some greater good. There is pointless evil. Therefore, it's less likely that God exists. So Rowe acknowledges that, inoculations obviously are accomplishing a greater good. Even the crucifixion of Christ, you could say, is accomplishing a greater good, so that's why God allows it. But there are numerous examples, he says, where there is no greater good being attained. Now, you might want to ask, well, how do you know that, Rowe? Are you God? Do you know all things? Well, Rowe has a response. He says, well, we make these kinds of inferences all the time, where we think it's reasonable to conclude that if I can't see the reason for something, that there probably is no reason for that something. It's called in philosophy, believe it or not, it's called a no-seeum inference. If I no-see it, it's probably not there, okay, is basically the way that it goes. And we do this really quite all the time, right? So if I were to proclaim there's a hurricane-force wind coming towards the campus of Southwestern with driving rains accompanying it, if you stepped outside and said, I don't see the rain, I don't see the wind, you would be justified in concluding that it's not there. Fair? Right? I no see it, therefore it's not there. If, on the other hand, I said, there's a dust mite in the corner, you would look over there and you'd say, I don't see a dust mite. Would you be justified in concluding that there is no dust mite there? No, why not? Because if there were a dust mite, you wouldn't expect to be able to see it anyways, right? Whereas if there were a hurricane-force wind, you would expect to be able to experience it, to see it, right? So a no-seeum inference is as valid as the expectation that we should see the thing that we're expecting is. So the question then is whether we ought to expect to see the purpose for each and every instance of evil and suffering in the world. Stephen Weixler articulates a position that has become known as skeptical theism. He's not skeptical of theism. He's saying that given theism, we should be skeptical that we would know what God is up to. We would not expect to grasp why God permits some evils to occur. We could expect to understand why he permits some evils, but there's other evils that would be beyond our comprehension. Why? Well, because he's God and I'm not. My brain is little itty bitty, and I'm fallen, and I'm finite, and I'm fallible, and God is none of those things. And so God will often have reasons that are beyond our comprehension. Recall again the inoculation of my son. Does my son have any clue what's going on? Can I try to explain to him why we're doing this? It's like typical philosophy thing to do, right? Son, it's okay, don't worry, this is going to hurt, right? It's going to hurt you a lot more than it's going to hurt us. But this is for your good, right? Down the road, you'll be thankful that we inoculated you. You're going to be immune to diseases and so on. You'll be very thankful down the road, son. My 3-month-old son going to get that? No, right? I can try to explain it. He just isn't in a position to be able to understand. Given Christianity, we are in much the same position vis-a-vis God. We are just simply not in a position to be able to understand what God would often be up to. Okay, let's skip forward. We're going to skip over that. We're going to skip over that. Okay, yeah, we'll come back to there. So, looked at briefly 2 versions of the atheistic argument against God, given the existence of evil in the world. I want to turn now to the positive argument of how evil and suffering points to the existence of God, not the other direction. Okay, so first, what I'm going to do here, we're going to build a cumulative argument in 6 steps, okay? So we're just going to walk through this. There's a little bit of kind of philosophical logic. Hopefully you're able to follow along. If you're not, we'll have some Q&A and we'll be able to sort it out, I hope, all right? Okay? So step 1, the worldview problem of evil requires the existence of objective evil, right? So we started off tonight noting that evil, that the experience and existence of evil is a universal worldview problem, right? That this is ubiquitous, it's across the board. We just recognize as human beings that there's evil and suffering in the world, and that all worldviews have to account for evil in the world. But in order for there to be a problem of evil, there has to be such a thing as evil, right? So if there is no object of evil, then there is no problem of evil, right? So if there is no OE, object of evil, then, horseshoe, there is no squiggly line, problem of evil. Okay, we follow that? We're good? Shake your head if you're not good. You're good? Thumbs up? Okay, so if there is no object of evil, then there is no problem of evil. The problem of evil requires that there be real object of evil, not just things that we don't like, right? but things that are really and truly evil, bad or negative states of affairs due to the wicked intentions or moral negligence on the part of free-willed moral agents. Evil cannot be just a subjective or relative matter, because if it is, then there is no worldview problem with evil. Okay, so this I think is pretty simple and straightforward. Step 2, the existence of objective evil requires there to be an objective standard for moral values and duties. Okay, so for there to be a worldview problem of evil, there has to be objective evil, but for there to be objective evil, there has to be a standard by which things are considered evil or not, right? So there has to be an objective standard that designates some things as meeting that standard and being good and other things deviating from that standard and being bad. So in symbolic format again, if there is no such thing as objective moral values and duties, then there is no such thing as objective evil. And again, our definition of evil, bad or negative states of affairs due to the wicked intentions or moral negligence on the part of free-willed moral agents. So, with our focus more narrowly on moral evil, the bad or negative states of affairs occur due to the intentions or negligence of free-willed creatures. But that outcome requires that there be a set of moral values and duties that are binding upon free-willed creatures. So think about it, right? If there are no objective moral values and duties, that would mean that there are no moral requirements for all human beings. No set of actions that are mandatory, no set of actions that are forbidden. And if there are no objective moral values and duties, then it's meaningless, literally meaningless, to say that Ted Bundy ought not to have raped and murdered college girls. If there are no objective moral values and duties, then it is meaningless to say ISIS fighters act wickedly when they cut off the heads of Christian civilians in Syria. We could very meaningfully say, I hate that rapists rape, or I really wish that ISIS would quit killing people. But in the absence of objective moral values and duties, one cannot uphold the existence of objective evil. Again, I think this is relatively simple and straightforward. It's the next step that I think is really controversial. The existence of objective moral values and duties, I contend, requires the existence of a transcendent, personal, moral creator, that is, God. Now, remembering that we're more narrowly focused on the Christian atheism debate, we can take that for now to be the God of Christianity. But if there is no God, my contention is that there can be no objective standard for moral values and duties. So, if no God, then no objective moral values and duties. Now, how many of you recognize this as part of an apologetic argument known as the moral argument for God's existence? Okay, very good. Right, popularized by C.S. Lewis, very effectively used by William Lane Craig today. And the fundamental insight behind this premise is that the existence of objective moral values and duties that are binding upon all people in all places at all times is dependent upon a transcendent source for moral truths. And the only plausible candidate for such moral truths, apart from kind of a Platonic notion of forms, a realm of the forms, is a personal creator, a personal moral divine being. If there is no such divine being, there cannot be such a thing as objective moral values and duties. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties don't exist either. Now, many, not all, but many thoughtful atheists have admitted that this is the case. Will Provine, the late professor of the history of biology at Cornell University, sorry, did I skip ahead too many? There we go. Claimed that the implications of atheistic evolution are stark but clear. There are no gods, no purposes, no life after death, no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning in life, and no free will for humans either, he chose to say, right? But no foundation for ethics, okay? We can still have ethical values, but they are not objective, because there's nothing upon which we can ground them. Similarly, Richard Dawkins, never to be confused with a great philosopher, but nonetheless a good thinker. In a universe, he says, of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. There is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Given the absence of God, this is what you expect. Now, lest you accuse me of cherry-picking atheists who are lousy philosophers, here is Bertrand Russell. Brief and powerless is man's life. On him and all his race the slow, sure doom falls, pitiless and dark. Blind to good and evil, reckless of destruction, omnipotent matter rolls on its relentless way. Right? So a lot of atheists recognize that, okay, in the absence of God, there is no foundation for objective moral values and duties. There just cannot be such a thing. Okay? We can still articulate our moral values and duties, but they're not objective. They're not binding upon all people in all places at all times. And C.S. Lewis notes that these considerations were partially responsible for him rejecting the atheism that he had embraced as an Oxford professor. He says, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense." Brilliant insights into how he used to think and part of what changed his mind. Now, not all atheists agree that God is required to sustain the existence of objective moral values and duties. There's a veritable cottage industry of non-religious philosophers and thinkers who seek alternative means of providing a foundation for objective moral truth. And what I find fascinating is that they set these up as objective ethical systems, only to acknowledge implicitly or explicitly that there's actually nothing objective about them at all. They're systems of ethics, yes, but not in the end objective. I want to take a couple of minutes to look at two of the most prominent and popular: social contract theory and evolutionary ethics. So first, social contract theory, or utilitarianism by some names, or some forms of utilitarianism. So some atheists will suggest that morality is a social construct. It's particular to individual human societies, right? So we establish moral standards in order to enable survival and promote human flourishing. So our society provides the moral values and boundaries for people that live within that society. So the morals, values, and duties are objective for those who live in your contemporary setting. So under this standard, ethical standards can differ over time and between cultures. So our social contract might be different now than it was 200 years ago, and it might be different than the social contract in Canada or Iceland or Syria. There might be nothing fixed or universal or absolute in human morality, right? Such that if you don't like your social contract, you could move to a different social contract or fight to have your own changed. Now, I find it fascinating that some atheists hold social contract theory to be a sufficient ground for objective moral values and duties. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I think, was one of these. Because at its root, social contract ethics is not an explanation of objective or universal values and duties, but a denial of them. How so? Well, two ways. First, it's on the same slide. Social contract theory denies the universality of ethics. Social contract ethics are by definition not universal, but rather they are local to your culture, to your society, to your social contract. So social contract ethicists promote their theories an explanation for the universality of human ethics. It simply is not and cannot be so. It's a denial of it. Furthermore, it's a denial of the objectivity of ethics. Different social contracts are by definition not good or bad. They are just different. Yeah. Now, frighteningly, that means that Hitler's genocidal ethic was not wrong. It was different, right? It was the German social contract. Well, what would that entail? That would mean that it was wrong for the Allies to prosecute war criminals at the Nuremberg trials. After all, those men and women were doing what was considered to be right and good under their social contract. Okay. Now, again, this, I think, is a denial of universal human sensibility, which holds that some things, even if they're acceptable under a particular social contract, are nonetheless objectively wrong. So social contract theory simply cannot account for the existence of a universal, objective moral standard. All right, second, and this one is probably more popular today, evolutionary ethics. Here the theory goes that morality develops as animals gain cognitive and relational capacities. So back in the 1970s, Robert Trivers developed the notion of reciprocal altruism, and it's kind of a cool story. He was like a grad student that was struggling to come up with like a thesis project, and so one night in kind of a drunken binge, he came up with this notion of reciprocal altruism, and he thought, well, maybe we can make a go of that. And so he tried to make a go of it, and it flourished, and it boomed, and it became kind of a standard explanation. And so he came up with it to try to describe why selfish creatures can be driven by evolutionary impulses to cooperate with other creatures, even when doing so seemed to jeopardize their immediate self-interest. And so he was interested, like in some species of fish, where there's like a really little itty-bitty fish that it basically makes its living by cleaning out the mouth of a big predator fish. And so the question is, okay, why doesn't the big predator fish eat it? Because after all, that's its immediate self-interest, right? Well, the idea is, well, it serves its long-term interest to not eat it because it protects it from parasites and mouth diseases. Well, why does the little fish risk its life every time it goes inside the mouth of the big predator fish? Well, because it's in its long-term interest to be able to make its living there because the big predator fish won't eat it. So there's a reciprocal kind of, I give up my immediate self-interest, which serves your self-interest, which serves my long-term interest, and in doing so, we build a moral code. So as humans evolve, we are social creatures, and so we gather in communities, and we develop communal ethical standards. So E.O. Wilson, Richard Dawkins, and others argue that it's in the long-term communal interests of species like humans to work together, to trust one another, and to put others ahead of oneself at times. It is better as a whole for people to risk their lives running into burning buildings to save others. Why? Well, because one day it might be you inside that burning building needing somebody else to run in to save you. So we risk our lives now so that others would be willing to risk their lives down the road. Similarly, it makes sense to care for helpless babies and aging parents. Why? Well, because down the road, we will probably need our children to care for us. And if our children saw us care for our elderly parents and remember us caring for them when they were helpless, they will be more likely to care for us too. And as these types of reciprocal altruistic insights accumulate, human societies begin to codify them into moral codes. Thou shalt honor thy father and mother. And it then goes better for society if these moral codes are enforced by some type of implicit or explicit moral police. Hence, God evolves to be the moral policeman. So our moral values and duties then have evolved over time. Now, the fundamental failure of evolutionary ethics is its inability to move beyond what is, ethically, to what ought to be. At best, evolutionary ethics can encourage us to cooperate on the basis that this will achieve our own long-term interests and warn us that failing to cooperate might cost us in the long run, but it cannot tell us how we ought to act. Indeed, there are some within evolutionary ethics that say we are best advised to keep the masses uninformed and adhering to some type of moral standard that they think is imposed on them by a divine standard, because that will ensure the preservation of the species better. What evolutionary ethics cannot do is establish the existence of an objective moral code. Why not? Because evolution, by its very nature, has one constant, and that one constant is change. And so we haven't arrived at the end point, right? Nancy Pearcey was pointing this out, transhumanism. This body is just one step on the evolutionary pathway. Our moral code today is just one step on the evolution. That's a good-looking donut. On the evolutionary pathway. I'm sorry, this is like an ADD thing. Squirrel, right? Our ethical standards are just one step on an evolutionary pathway. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this very, very clearly. He saw the insights of atheism and where it leads, right? That given atheism, given no God, you might say that this ethical standard has evolved, but who's to say, he says, that I'm not the next step in evolution, that I've achieved the Ubermensch, that I am the Superman, the Overman, and that your moral standards do not apply to me because I'm on the next level. Who is to say? Well, no one can say. So evolutionary ethics, again, can't establish an objective moral code. What is right today may be wrong tomorrow. What is wrong today might be right tomorrow. What is right for me might be wrong for someone else who is either more highly evolved or closer to being an amoeba. Ethical standards are ultimately relative. So indeed, an objective moral standard by definition must exist externally to us. It can't be something that we arrive at communally or that is just produced within us biologically. It requires an external source beyond or transcendent to our human existence. An objective moral standard requires something very much like our Christian understanding of God. There is no good without God. Alternative sources for a universal object of moral values and duties are simply insufficient. So premise 3 again, if there is no God, then there are no objective moral values and duties. I spent the most time on that premise because I think it is the really contentious one in this argument. But where does this then leave us? Given atheism, it seems there is no problem of evil. If God does not exist, then the problem of evil cannot even get off the ground. So, premise 4, right, is the atheist contention. There is no God, right? God does not exist. But remember what was premise 3? If there is no God, there are no objective moral values and duties. Therefore, if there is no God, then we conclude there are no objective moral values and duties, okay? But premise 2, if there are no objective moral values and duties, then there is no object of evil. So given that we've arrived at, from the atheist contention, there are no object of moral values and duties, now it follows that there is no object of evil. But if there is no object of evil, then there is no problem of evil. The problem of evil can't even get off the ground. So you combine the starting point and the intermediate steps and the end point, we arrive at the conclusion. If God does not exist, there simply is no worldview problem of evil to begin with. Worldviews, atheism or Christianity alike, do not need to account for evil and suffering in the world. Why? Because there isn't any objective evil in the world. As Russell, Dawkins, and Provine note, a universe without a superintending divine being would be expected to be a world without moral oughts, a world without objective moral values and duties, and hence without a problem of evil to begin with. But how did we get started on this whole journey in the first place? Well, it began with the atheist accusation that evil serves as evidence against the existence of God. All worldviews recognize that evil is a reality, experience or existence of evil, right? Bad or negative states of affairs due to the wicked intentions or moral negligence on the part of free-willed moral agents. And atheists use these bad or negative states of affairs to serve as exhibit A against the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God. Hume, Mackey, Rowe, and others insist that the existence or amount or type of evil that we see demonstrates that God cannot or most likely does not exist. But if the problem of evil doesn't exist, if God doesn't exist, then the problem of evil cannot be used as an argument against God's existence. It seems that the atheist is caught between a rock and a hard place. They can either abandon the arguments against God based on evil, or they can maintain their belief in the existence of evil and abandon their objections against the existence of God. Did I get that in the right order? Okay, accept evil and abandon arguments against God, or maintain rejection of God and abandon belief in evil. Now, take those two options in turn, right? This is the one that we just followed, so I'm not going to walk through it again, right? But if God does not exist, there is no problem of evil, okay? So God doesn't exist, there are no objective moral standards for values, moral values and duties. Hence, there is no object of evil. Hence, there is no worldview problem of evil. But what if we go the other way around? Okay, what if they want to maintain the rejection? If they want to maintain the rejection of God's existence, they can't complain about evil and suffering in the world. But going the other way around, if we start where we actually started, with the worldview recognition that evil exists and must be accounted for by any adequate worldview, then this is the way the argument works. Okay, so this is the culmination. This is what I think is the positive argument for God from evil. First, we start with the worldview recognition that there is a problem of evil. A worldview problem of evil exists. Okay, my conclusion is going to be, therefore, God exists, right? So step one, it is not the case that there is not a worldview problem of evil, right? Double negative, positive. That is, there is a problem of evil that all worldviews need to address. Our premise one from earlier, if there is no object of evil, there is no problem of evil. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. By modus tollens, therefore it is not the case that there is no object of evil. Or, to put it positively, objective evil exists. Premise two from earlier, if there are no objective moral values and duties, then there is no object of evil. So again, by modus tollens, if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Therefore, it is not the case that there is not objective moral values and duties. Or to put it positively, there is an objective standard for moral values and duties. Premise three from earlier, if God doesn't exist, then there is no objective standard for moral values and duties. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. That is, it is not the case that God does not exist. Or, to put it positively, God exists. So in this way, I contend the existence of evil, the very problem of evil that atheists want to use against Christianity, serves more powerfully and successfully as an argument for God's existence. If real evil exists, as virtually all human beings acknowledge that it does, then we are required to posit the existence of a transcendent, personal, moral, divine being who serves as an objective standard for moral values and duties. It is when that objective standard is violated that we are able to identify actions or states of affairs as objectively evil. And it's only by acknowledging those objectively evil actions or states of affairs that we can begin to face the worldview problem of evil. If there is a problem of evil, there is a God. I think the atheist is stuck in this case. So in conclusion, the existence of evil points to, not away from, God's existence. Given Christianity, encompassing the creation, fall, redemption, glorification worldview narrative, evil and suffering is expected, explicable, and redeemable. Given atheism, evil and suffering is either non-existent or inexplicable, and it is certainly irredeemable. It's really profoundly ironic. How many of you have read Bart Ehrman's book, God's Problem? It's a beautiful book, and it's very powerful, but it's severely sad when he ends by noting, he has this diatribe against biblical treatments of evil, and he rejects God. He says God can't account for evil and suffering in the world, and he encourages his readers with these words. He says, we need to alleviate suffering and bring hope to a world devoid of hope. What he's been doing for the previous 200 pages is systematically rejecting the one transcendent eschatological source of hope available to human beings who are suffering temporal evils with no prospects for earthly remediation. It's only within Ehrman's atheistic worldview that the world is a world devoid of hope. Given a Christian worldview, the existence of a God who is both holy and transcendent, we can and should still seek, as Ehrman encourages us to alleviate suffering, but we can also articulate a true and a meaningful hope, one which has traditionally resonated with human beings across civilizations and cultures. Does evil exist? Is there a worldview problem of evil? I think it does, and there is. And if so, my contention is that the acknowledgement of real evil in the world serves as an argument for, not against, the existence of God. So the next time you hear an atheist talk about the problem of evil, perhaps ask the question, whose problem is this? All right, thank you. All right, I think we've got maybe 10 or 15 minutes for questions. I skipped over so much so quickly, I might have been able to say more, but that's okay. Question here in the second row. We use the microphone so that it gets, I think, on the recording as well.
I believe in the existence of objective moral values and duties, but could you discuss what you would say to someone related to the fact that in different cultures there's different attitudes? For example, we spent a number of years in India, and when someone becomes a Christian and they stop going to the temple, that's a problem because in that culture, to go to temple is what you do if you are a good and righteous person. And so I think I have some ideas, but I just would like to hear your spin or viewpoint on it, like the difference between cultures.
It's an excellent question, right? It's actually a series of questions, but excellent questions. Two things that I'll say briefly, and that might lead to more, it might not. First of all, people can be wrong. Right, so we can have perspectives that are just mistaken. We can be mistaken in scientific reasoning. We can be mistaken in religious reasoning. Why would we expect it to be any different in the moral sphere? Right? We can just be wrong about what we think are objective moral standards. That goes for us. It also goes for people in India. Right? So if a culture can have an understanding that X is morally approvable, and the culture can be just wrong. Right? The ancient Mayans practiced human sacrifice, and they believed that that was commendable. Right? I think by and large that we all today think that they were just objectively wrong. So first of all, people can be just mistaken in their moral reasoning, just like they can be mistaken in their scientific reasoning. It's probably not what I want to lead off with if I'm in a different culture, right? Well, you guys are just, stupid. You're just morally ignorant, so get with the program. But the other thing I think we need to recognize is that cultures can have different moral practices without having different objective moral values. Right? And I'm not saying that this is going to be a case of that, but the one that always sticks with me, I think C.S. Lewis uses this one either in Mere Christianity or in The Abolition of Man, I can't remember which, but he talks about a basically universal moral value, which is respect your elders. Okay, so in the Judeo-Christian tradition, obviously, it's the sixth commandment. Oh dear, that's not on tape. Darn it. Honor thy father and mother, right? So that's representative of this universal respect for ancestors. Well, that can look very different in different cultures, right? So in India, one of the things it means is you don't eat cows. Why? Well, because grandma could have been reincarnated in a cow, so you don't eat grandma, right? You know, that's just kind of a nice, respectful thing. If you respect grandma, don't eat her, right? I don't eat my grandma. Do you eat your grandma? Well, no. Okay, so don't eat grandma, right? So that's one of the ways that respect your elders works out. In many traditional Chinese societies, respect for elders means that when mom and dad get elderly, unable to take care of themselves, they move in with oldest offspring, right? And that's respect for elders, okay? Normal, it seems to make sense. In Inuit culture, it works out a little bit differently. When the elders come to the point where they can no longer contribute to the flourishing of society, respect for elders means you put them on an ice floe and you send them out to sea to die of exposure. Why? Because they don't want to be a burden on society to take scarce resources that would otherwise be given to the younger generation who can contribute to the continued survival of the community. And so they would rather die with dignity on an ice floe. And so respecting your elders now this is not contemporary Inuit cultures, okay, but 100, 200, 300 years ago, you send them off on an ice floe to die, right? So the same moral value, respect, honor your elders, worked out in very different ways in different cultures. So sometimes I think we want to ask the question, is this really articulating a different moral value? Or is it just working out the moral value in different ways in different settings? Right, so I think both of those things are important to be able to say in response. Does that help some? Yeah. Good question.
So how would you address I'm trying to think of how to word this, the euthyphro dilemma within divine command theory? Or I guess there's natural law too, but I think, yeah.
All right, so the euthyphro dilemma, for any who aren't familiar with it, Socrates poses this dilemma to young Euthyphro. Euthyphro, they're talking about the nature of goodness or piety, and Euthyphro's kind of like, well, what the gods approve of is good. And so Socrates kind of, and I'll just distill it to kind of a Western monotheistic tradition, right? So does God approve of it because it is good, or is it good because God approves of it? That's the dilemma that Socrates puts out, okay? So it comes down to us as the Euthyphro dilemma. And it's a dilemma. A dilemma is a choice between two unpleasant options, right? Neither of which seems acceptable to a Christian. If God says it's good because it is good, right, then it seems that goodness is a standard that's higher than God, which means that God is not the ultimate, right? If, on the other hand, it's good simply because God declares it good, then goodness is arbitrary, and it's like God could have flipped a coin. You know, if it's heads, adultery bad, tails, adultery good. Okay, heads, okay, adultery is bad, thou shalt not commit adultery, okay? That is arbitrary. God could have chosen differently, and then our moral standards would be different, right? So that's the Euthyphro dilemma. Is goodness higher than God, or is goodness arbitrary? The traditional, and I think correct, monotheistic way to respond to that is that it's neither, right? Goodness is neither higher than God, nor is it arbitrary. Rather, what is good is a reflection of who God is, right? So God's moral law is simply an expression of God's character. Right, so we can't separate God's articulation of morality with who God is. So goodness isn't what God declares, goodness is who God is. In the same way, this might not be quite as easy to swallow, but I agree the same thing is true of the laws of rationality. Right? The laws of logic aren't something that God arbitrarily decrees, they're just a reflection of who God is. Right? So when we, quote unquote, discover the law of non-contradiction, we've not discovered something that God has created. We've discovered something that God is. Right? So when we hear the moral law or discover through natural philosophy the moral law, we haven't discovered something that God has created. We've discovered something of who God is. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's another very good question. And this is a very common atheistic question. And I think a lot of atheists ask the question as if, no Christian has ever thought about this one before. Got you stumped. It's like, nah, people have been talking about this since like the 2nd century, for crying out loud, right? Christians, oftentimes we just need to do our history, right? We need to read those who have gone before, because the questions that are being asked today, by and large, have been asked thousands of times in the past. Okay, I'm sorry. Now I'm ranting. Other questions? Good questions. Question in the back. Yeah. Andrew, right? Haha, I remembered a name.
Do you have your own mic back there?
That means I know all of one name here. No, two. I know Leo, too.
I am relatively new to philosophy and apologetics, so I don't know if this question is even necessary, but it comes to my mind anyway. We kind of take, it seems like as I've listened to atheist and Christian responses to the problem of evil, generally people accept that evil exists, and even, I think of how I'm trying to word this. Well, I guess I'm thinking about it more in with morality. Objective morality exists. How do you, he asked a question of cultures earlier, and how do you say that, or how would you defend objective morality if someone were to say, well, that's clearly an example of relative morality? And you said
Right. Okay.
that, I don't know, how do you define, how do you prove, I don't know, I'm not wording it the way I'm trying to, but
I think I understand what you're getting at. You're kind of getting at how do we establish the reality of objective morality
yes.
if somebody might be inclined to dispute that?
Yes.
Yeah. I think what is most helpful is to guide people into realizing I don't think we have to convince them that objective morality exists. I think we just have to show them that they already believe that objective morality exists. Okay. There's two equal and opposite errors when it comes to the question of objective morality. Okay. The one is to think that there is no such thing as objective morality. The other is to think that every single situation in the human moral sphere is governed by an absolute yes or no, right and wrong. And I think those are both equally erroneous, okay? I'll get to this one in a moment, right, that there is no objective morality. But the other one I think is just extremely easy to demonstrate, right? When you put your shoes on in the morning, which one ought you to put on first, the left or the right? Like, who cares, right? But I mean, that's an action that we take, right? But is there an objective standard as to which is the right way to go about it? Well, no, clearly not, right? So not everything is governed by an objective yes and no, right or wrong. That recognition leads, I think, a lot of people to jump to the opposite conclusion, right? That therefore there's nothing that is governed by an objective right or wrong. And again, I just think that's silly. Okay, so in philosophy we talk about, let me ask this question. How many white swans need to exist to prove that there is at least one white swan in the world? One. Okay, I asked the question in a really stupid way, right? How many white swans do you have to find to prove that there is such a thing as white swans? One, right? How many objective moral truths do you have to discover to establish that there is objective morality? One, okay? So it's not the case, it doesn't have to be the case, and it certainly isn't the case, that all situations are governed by an objective yes or no, right or wrong. In order for objective morality to exist, we only need to be able to arrive at least one thing that is governed by objective morality. Well, that's much easier, I think, to show people that they already believe. And it's pretty easy. I mean, at cocktail parties, you just break out torturing babies for fun, right? Like, okay, so, little Mr. Postmodernist, you think that morality is just, relative? I like chocolate, you like vanilla. I came from, Armenia, and in Armenia, it's, cool. It's, all culturally apropos to torture babies for fun. This is our backyard game, right? We just, we cut the heads off of babies, and we use them as our baseballs to knock around the yard. Isn't that cool, right? It's good to us, right? So that's just okay, right? You're not going to find many non-psychotic people who will say, oh, well, I guess if that's okay for you, then that's okay. Right? No, you're going to find that people, they have this intuition. Arguments from intuition get a bad name. I don't know why. Right? I think some of the most profound truths that we recognize are recognized intuitionally. We just know that torturing babies for fun is wrong, right? We know that. The atheist that we encounter on the street knows that. The postmodernist that we meet in Starbucks knows that. We just have to help them discover that, okay, well, you think there's at least one thing that is wrong for all people in all places at all times. Well, that's all that I'm saying, right? That's all that there has to be for objective morality to exist. For objective evil to exist, there only has to be one thing, torturing babies for fun, that we all acknowledge is wrong in all situations and culture. And incidentally, not everybody has to even acknowledge it. It can be objectively true even if some people deny it, right? Look, guys, hope there's no flat earthers here, but the earth is round, right? That's just an objective truth. It's either objectively true or it's not. And if somebody disagrees with it, that's kind of irrelevant. It's beside the point, right? Reality does not depend upon everybody agreeing to it. But no, I do think that we all share this intuition that there are at least some things that we know are objectively evil or that are objectively good. And that's all that we need to be able to get objective morality off the ground. Does that kind of help respond? I think that we're about out of time.
Well, if you're Baptist and you think cocktail parties are morally evil, then you've already got it.
I was thinking of the little weenies and the cocktail
Oh,
sauce
okay,
and that
okay,
kind of
oh, okay.
cocktail party.
Different
I'm not sure what
cocktail
you were thinking
Yeah.
about, but
All right. Well, you guys thank Tawa for that. That was awesome. All right. Well, you are dismissed for the evening, but hang on. Let me just tell you what's going on in the morning. At 9 a.m., we start back up here. We're going to start right into a session, so come having eaten breakfast and all that. Okay, so we're going to start right into the session at 9 a.m.